The 4th of May, 1942, the sky over the Coral Sea was hard and cold like polished metal. A wind blew from the Pacific, steady and relentless. The waves rolled in long, lazy swells, as if the sea itself refused to believe the smoke and rage that were about to erupt above it. On the bridges of the carriers, both Japanese and American, men gripped rails and looked in the same direction, at the spot on the chart tables where a thin line pointed to a port that could make the world wider and more terrifying, Port Moresby. Around that point, in those days, revolved a plan that, under other circumstances, might have grown into an invasion of the continent, but which in the end was never carried out. This is the story of why the Japanese advance on Australia never happened. Not of rumors or the panic of newspaper pages, but of decisions in offices, of planes lost over the sea, of tons of fuel that could not be obtained, and of thousands of people who would have had to be ferried across an ocean, and of those places where these complex numbers subtracted from the loudest ambitions. I will tell it like a film. Scenes lit by the lamp glow of generals, shots of decks rising above explosions, and long takes of maps where red arrows tighten and then disappear. But beneath all this theatrics lies strict arithmetic and documented history. In the offices of the Japanese Empire in late 1941 and early 1942, plans began to appear on paper and on maps that were meant to secure the warm southern approaches to the empire. Northern Australia, on the maps, looked vulnerable, vast spaces with sparse garrisons, ports far from main sea routes but with strategic value. They could become footholds for further pressure on Anglo-American supply lines. Two voices were heard in Tokyo: the Navy's voice, which saw in the southern outlet a chance to expand the empire's defensive perimeter, and the Army's voice, which considered any distant amphibious operation dangerous and resource-consuming. The rift between these views proved decisive. The Navy, trained to rely on maneuver and strikes by carrier aircraft, pictured a scenario in which the seizure of several key points, ports and islands, would allow its reach to extend farther south. The option of isolating Australia through a network of bases and airfields in New Guinea and the Solomon Islands was attractive. If Port Moresby and several nearby points could be taken, they could be used to harass convoys and impede the transfer of Allied troops. But the Army saw it differently. Holding even limited stretches of Australian coast would require huge contingents of infantry, artillery, food, and a continuous stream of transports, resources that the Japanese economy and fleet could not shoulder without serious destabilization of other theaters. This clash of logics, naval ambition against army realism, carved the band of uncertainty in which the idea of paralysis rather than full invasion was born. In the spring of 1942, the command of the Imperial Japanese Navy developed and began to implement an operation codenamed MO. The objective was clear and practical: seize Port Moresby on the southeastern coast of New Guinea and occupy select points in the Solomon Islands, notably Tulagi. From these footholds, Japanese forces could establish an air and naval blockade, threaten approaches to Australia, and perhaps in one motion sever Anglo-American lines of communication and supply. Convoys, landing groups, and carrier air were prepared, everything required for an ambitious but technically limited operation. Around the 1st of May, the exact dates vary in documents, but at the start of the month, Japanese landing forces moved on Tulagi, and simultaneously a convoy bound for Port Moresby sailed under escort and carrier air cover. Yet the connecting strands of the plan proved fragile. American command, aided with successes in decrypting Japanese radio traffic, had an inkling of the operation and was able to deploy forces against it, including carriers and naval aviation. What was supposed to be a swift and nearly silent seizure of convenient footholds became a clash of fleets on the open sea. The events in the Coral Sea from the 4th through the 8th of May 1942 were pivotal not so much for the loss of steel and timber as for proving that in the modern ocean, aircraft determine outcomes. For the first time in history, large fleet formations fought not face-to-face but through their air groups. Planes hunted ships using signals intelligence and visual reports, and their strikes decided the fate of fleets. In those days, the Japanese force lost the light carrier Shoho and suffered significant losses in aircraft and air crews. In turn, the Americans lost the carrier Lexington and sustained serious damage to Yorktown. In practical terms, the chief result of that fight was that the plan to land at Port Moresby became too risky. Japan no longer had sufficient air cover to protect transports and a landing. Picture that evening in the operations room of one of the Japanese flagships. Photographs of carrier planes on the table, the convoy's route drawn on the chart. Telegrams and intercepted radio messages arrived in brittle lines, losses, damage, confused reports from crews returning from combat missions. Reports of pilot casualties ran along the tape, trained, experienced men who turned out to be almost more valuable than the ships themselves. When it became clear that the Japanese fleet lacked secure control of the air in the operational area, the landing phase was doomed. It was this, not a single blunder, that halted the Japanese push toward a direct landing on Australia at that moment. War is not only battles, it is also mountains of numbers. How many people must be transported to hold a stretch of coastline the size of a small state? How much food and fuel are needed each month? How many transport ships and escorting destroyers are required to ensure these flows do not become easy prey? Answers to those questions turned dreams of invasion into a heavy, almost unthinkable task. Army estimates spoke of hundreds of thousands of soldiers and millions of tons of supplies needed even to hold limited footholds in northern Australia. Japan's merchant and transport shipping, already strained by existing supply obligations to occupied territories, could not shoulder those burdens without serious destabilization of other theaters. While panic grew in Australian cities and headlines warned of a landing in 3 days, the figures in Tokyo spoke for themselves. Even if symbolic landings on northern beaches had been achieved, holding them would have been impossible. Australia's roads and infrastructure were not only scant, but scattered, and the nearest large supply bases lay hundreds of miles away. Fewer and fewer responsible people in the Japanese command believed capture and occupation could be accomplished. Thus, in strategic plans, the idea prevailed, not to seize the entire continent, but to make it useless, cut it off from allies, and turn it into an island from which they could not threaten Japanese holdings. If May belonged to the Coral Sea, June brought a shock that changed the fate of the entire Pacific theater. The 4th of June, 1942, saw the Battle of Midway, where the Japanese fleet, intending to eliminate American carrier power and secure the Central Pacific, met an opponent that had prepared in advance, thanks to code-breaking and operational foresight. The result was catastrophic for the Japanese fleet. In a few tense hours, Japan lost 4 fleet carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, along with hundreds of veteran pilots and a major portion of its carrier aviation resources. Those losses could not be easily replaced. They meant Japan lost the ability to risk large carrier formations far from its bases. The consequences were direct. Plans for further southward advance and expansion toward Fiji, Samoa, and New Caledonia, the very projects that might have finally isolated Australia and prepared a springboard for renewed pressure, became impractical. Operation FS, intended as a continuation of the Southern Campaign and a step toward completing Australia's blockade, was formally postponed and later cancelled. Losses in aviation and ships, the altered balance of power, and economic reality made an invasion of Australia politically and tactically unfeasible in the foreseeable future. Streets in Darwin, radio channels in Canberra, emergency government meetings, fear became part of daily life in that country. The bombing of Darwin in February 1942, attacks by midget submarines on Sydney Harbor, these events fed the belief in an imminent landing. Political leaders held emergency councils, the population mobilized, local authorities built fortifications and organized evacuations. The public and the press painted images of columns of infantry moving along coastal roads. But historians who study wartime documents note that Japanese policy had already been leaning away from a full-scale invasion and toward its alternative, isolating the continent and conducting raids on supply infrastructure. Still, the emotional effect of the attacks was enormous. For the ordinary Australian, air filled with sirens and explosions was evidence of a real threat. Even today, memories of those years are full of scenes of people preparing for the worst. Sandbags piled up, prayers whispered, last belongings loaded onto small trucks. That is one side of the story, human, alive, full of anxiety. The other, the strategic side, was colder and more calculated. Tokyo did the arithmetic and decided that capturing Australia was too costly. If one asks strictly what exactly prevented the Japanese from landing, the correct answer is a series of points that come together to form a dense web of refusals and constraints. First, prolonged debate in the capitals had led Japanese policy toward isolating the continent rather than risking a landing operation. Second, the defeat in the Battle of the Coral Sea made reliable carrier-based air support for a landing impossible. Third, arithmetic, the tons of transport and number of infantry, made the operation practically unfeasible. Fourth, the defeat at Midway in early June crushed Japan's offensive capabilities in the Far Theater. And finally, plans for further expansion, including Operation FS, were postponed and canceled in light of the new realities. Together, all these factors resulted in the continent remaining free from direct military occupation. This was not a one-day victory, not one battle, not one order. It was a victory of no. Many refusals, of ambitions, of risk, of capability, that in sum gave Australia the chance to preserve its territorial independence. It was through the accumulation of these limiting factors, logistics, losses in the air, political decisions, and equipment losses, that what now seems obvious was accomplished. Japan did not invade Australia. When you leaf through military archives, reading commanders' reports and translators' dispatches, you see that the fate of great decisions is made up of small episodes. Someone's radio noise, someone's missed dive, someone's cancellation order. For Australians, it was a year of anxiety and struggle. For the Japanese, it was a series of adjustments to old plans under the pressure of new realities. For history, it is an example of how material capabilities and strategic decisions intertwine with the drama of human lives. If you imagine a final shot, it is not a scene of occupying parades. It is a chart slowly folding on a table in the warm lamp glow and a stack of papers stamped "Cancelled." The plans exist, the calculations exist, but there is no source capable of making them reality. It is the calm sea horizon off Australia's northern coast, where waves roll in long ranks, and where, although the storms were not yet over, no large-scale landings took place.